3PNR with Adam R. Welcome to 3PNR. I'm your host, Adam R. And joining me for this episode is Kathleen Marden. Kathleen, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Great to be with you.
I'm glad to have your time. Always glad to have your time. We were talking in pre-podcast. I was telling you about, I started diving into the abduction phenomenon of experiencers, and it is taxing on the mind. I mean, it could absolutely affect the psyche, 100%.
It absolutely can. You can't get away from it once you delve into this topic. And you might even begin to experience it yourself if you start to work with experiencers of contact.
Yeah, I'll say because, and I said this on a previous podcast just recently, bizarre could be, and again, maybe it's because of the amount of research and all the case files and the documentaries. I had a dream, Kathleen. I'm not kidding you. In my dream, I was laying on my side and I felt something touch the back of my head and I was like paralyzed. And for some odd reason, it's like I knew. And prior to that, in the dream, a friend of mine's like, hey, we taking to see the ant people. And, you know, obviously it's my subconscious. And I told my friend, like, how about we schedule that for Tuesday? That's the podcaster in me trying to get it scheduled, right? And I felt like a pressure in the back of my head, like something was drilling. And I literally fought my way up to my feet and ran to the bathroom, crashed through the bathroom door and looked in the mirror. And there was this thing on my back. And instead of being fearful, it wasn't looking directly at me. I was like, look at me, like as harsh as you could say. It's like I was telling it to look at me, and I was like, what am I going to get out of this? Or you know, or what do I? Something like I was trying to bargain with it. What do I get?
What were you seeing on your back?
It was like a little gray guy on my back holding on, and its head wasn't looking at the mirror. And I commanded it to look at me, and it looked at and I saw it in the mirror. It looked at me, and I was like, what am I going to get out of this? I wake up from this dream. It's early morning, and I didn't want to go back to sleep. I forced myself to repeat it over and over again so I didn't forget, so I could take down notes.
So you were not awake when you ran to the mirror.
No, it was all part of the dream.
It was all part of the dream.
Yeah.
Okay.
I personally never witnessed anything. I've never had any experiences, not ghosts, aliens, nothing at all. But I think leading to that, I was doing so much research. I was like, Kathleen, that's why I say, how do you do it? How do you do it, Kathleen? I've
devoted full time for the past 32 years to this. And how do I do it? I'm driven. You might say I'm driven. I was just extraordinarily interested in finding answers. You know, because Betty and Barney Hill were my aunt and uncle, the first scientifically investigated case of alien abduction in the United States. And I was a teenager when that occurred, and I was very close to them. So it became an important part of my life. And then when I started to have my own experiences, it increased my interest. I made the decision that I would take that secret to my grave, but I've recently acknowledged the fact that it has indeed happened to me.
Yeah, and that's an important part, right? Because someone like you, you make people of profession more comfortable to come out and speak about it, right? I mean, your approach to ufology is extremely professional. I've monitored you for some time. Before the podcast started, I started researching who do I need to speak to, and your name constantly popped up. And you bring a level of professionalism to it that allows other people of professionalism to say, look, this happened. I want to speak about it. And so let's talk about your experience and when you started, you know, as it started, when you realized it was happening, and how did you deal with it moving forward?
Well, I believe that my first conscious memory was when I was 17. And unbeknownst to me, my Aunt Betty Hill was conducting a series of what they called psychophysics experiments with a team of scientists, where she would attempt to call in a craft, and the scientists would go out to see if they could see the craft in the sky. And she determined that it took, I believe it was 2 months of nightly messages that she would send to these extraterrestrials before the craft would actually show up for the scientific team. And then she was attempting to call in the craft to land on my grandparents' farm. I grew up across the street from my grandparents' farm, and one did come in for a landing, and it was observed by two people. One of them was a commercial pilot returning home from work. And my mother and I remembered being on the craft that night. And it terrified me for years. And I finally remembered what the ETs looked like, sort of in a powerful abreaction. And an abreaction is a release of emotion.
Right. Like a chemical response.
And I was on a table. They were taking samples. They were doing things to me. I had a physical awareness, meaning pain in my body, the following day. And they told me that they were taking tissue samples from my body in order to check me for toxicity, environmental toxicity. And it did not make sense to me at that time or for the next 20 to 30 years, when I finally discovered that just uphill from my childhood home was a toxic waste dump.
Wow.
That became a Superfund site. And only 20 miles away was a nuclear base. So, Pease Air Force Base. So, both of those things make sense to me now. And I have a sense that these entities who did take tissue samples from time to time throughout my life were concerned about my health.
Right. Because for me, you're part of a family, right? And this is becoming very common that I'm finding this. They select certain genealogy relation, or people of relation, and they follow that genealogy. And it perhaps in your scenario, you're living near this toxic area, nuclear base, and so you're part of a study, or at least your family is. And so they have a concern, because like us, for scientists, if we have a lab animal and we discover it's getting sick, we're like, well, what's getting it sick? We got to figure this out. This is our lab animal. We're doing a study. We got to make sure it's healthy and happy, right? At the end of the day. So yeah, I would assume that they would want to make sure that their subject is in good form so they can monitor. Is that about right?
Well, I would think so. And Betty and Barney lived right next door to a nuclear base, Pease Air Force Base. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. I mean, I never knew that about Barney and Betty Hill. I didn't know they lived so close to something like that.
Yes.
That could be part of the interest. I mean, there's a lot of factors if you're an intelligent species watching another species, right? You're observing them, and you observe their history anyway. Now, bearing in mind, I'm under the impression they've been watching us for thousands of years, perhaps longer, from the very beginning.
I suspect that they have, according to the archaeological evidence and the paintings that hang in the Vatican in Rome, the Vatican Museum. So, yes, and in the ancient cave drawings.
Yeah, and then they're watching our species evolve, or what we call evolve, and they get to a point where it's like the 50s and 60s, and they're seeing different races of our species coming together. Now, this is Barney and Benny Hill. They're an interracial couple, and sure, this is going to pique their interest. Like, well, let's see how this goes, and let's see how it affects their social environment. What's the impact on the genealogy? It's a fantastic case for them to watch, right? It
is, but also I think that we need to be aware of the fact that Betty and Barney were very active in the civil rights movement and in assisting people in their community and in the state of New Hampshire where they lived. Barney was appointed in 1965 to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He was given an award by Sergeant Shriver in 1965 for setting up the Rockingham County Community Action Program using funds from the Office of Economic Opportunity. He was given an award by the Archdiocese of Manchester, New Hampshire, for setting up a literacy program for the people of New Hampshire because you had to pass a literacy test in order to vote. So Betty and Barney, and she was a social worker, they were very much involved in helping their fellow humans. And I think that these entities would probably have a great interest in people who have kind hearts.
Right, that are making evolutionary steps in our species. Because if, let's say hypothetically, Kathleen and I we're part of National Geographic, and we're watching Pride of Lions. One day, we see one lion bridging the gap between their pride and another pride and forming peace. That would, imagine the interest we would have in that. We would, don't touch those lions. Don't even let them know we're here. We got to watch this. This is evolution in real time. So of course that's a peak of interest for them. For you, all right. So let's get to the part where you've had your encounters and they're taking tissue sample. What's your feelings on it, the whole thing? Because did you have a personal opinion at the time?
At the time, I was just terrified. I didn't know what was happening. In fact, I was so confused by this that I tried to explain those memories away as being conventional. And that explanation was that my mother knew that I had to have surgery, but she wanted it to be done secretly in the middle of the night. And so she had assembled a surgical team, and I had had surgery in the middle of the night, which is an absolutely absurd explanation.
Yeah, but for a kid, it's rational, right? Because you're like, all right, I got to explain this away, and the only way I can. I mean,
yes.
You're protecting yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And, so that is the way I was thinking about it at the time. There are times when I walked with trepidation at night. I was terrified. I didn't want to be alone. And then eventually, through sheer force of will, I made the decision that I could live life as a victim, or I could become a participant in all of this. And perhaps I could try to find answers. Perhaps I could communicate with them. Now, I'm a hypnotherapist and a quantum healing hypnosis practitioner. So what I did is I had Denise Stoner hypnotize me and give me keywords that I could give to myself so that I could conduct a rapid induction on myself. And I practiced that over and over again every day so that when these entities came into my environment, I could say those words or I could even think them. And it would cause me to become very, very relaxed and to project love in their direction. And it worked.
For people that hear that and they're like, that sounds nuts. Athletes do that all the time. That's a mental place athletes go to, and they use keywords. I know this for some, even boxers that go through this. They use these words in their head to trigger a different part of them, right? To elevate their mental and physical prowess. So
They've probably had sports hypnosis. Now, in hypnosis, if we're going to see a person more than once, we give them those key words so that we can say those words to them, and they will go into a deep state of trance, not of hypnosis. So we don't have to do the induction all over again, which takes about 45 minutes.
right. I play pool and I have a routine. I do it every time.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, I go over, I visualize my game and I visualize the win. And I repeat the same kind of verbiage to myself to make sure I'm mentally there. So everything you're telling me checks out as far as what people could look into to do these things. I 1,000% agree with you. And I love Denise Stoner, by the way. I love her. She's great.
I do too.
So now, is that outside of those occurrences in your childhood, how are you getting visited often, or did it stop?
It stopped. It stopped in 2015, I believe, but it definitely stopped when I began to do an experiment, an investigation in 2016, after I was invited by experiencer Kevin Briggs to communicate with the Council of Eight. I had already received information from the entities who had been in contact with me, taking me to craft. But then the Council of Eight stepped in and they said, we will protect you. I haven't had contact with the other entities since that occurred. And the Council of Eight is, extremely loving.
So what are some of the experiences you had? Have you had negative ones since then, or what are some of the experiences in between from childhood up until that point?
When I was in my 20s, they would take me maybe once a month for a while. And, they were doing the typical extraction of ova.
Okay.
I do not remember ever observing a hybrid. I know a lot of experiencers have. I haven't had that much hypnosis. I haven't gone there. So perhaps that's why. I do remember being shown like very large test tubes, huge test tubes,
right,
made of what appeared to be a very thick material, and it seemed to magnify what was inside. And there was a liquid or some kind of viscous fluid inside, and there were fetuses growing. So I've been shown that. But that's all I remember,
right,
is having seen that.
To support that, if tomorrow, and we will be doing this in the upcoming future, eventually we'll become interplanetary. The technology will arise. We're finding planets like crazy right now. Like, we can't even keep up with how many planets we're finding that are in the Goldilocks zone, nonetheless. And if we make it to one of these planets where, hypothetically speaking, there's one that I saw in a documentary, it's larger than us, but it's rocky with a water surface, or at least to their measurements and what they calculate. And we go there and we find another species of being. And perhaps they're relevantly close to us by as far as light years go, but they could be in their Stone Age, or they could be in the Bronze Age, or, very likely that they are, maybe they're equivalent to us. In either case, we can't breathe their kind of oxygen or air or whatever they're breathing. We can't do that. We can observe them because naturally, like, it's the rules of National Geographic. We can observe, but we can't get involved, right? We can't influence their wars or their politics or whatever it is. But we do eventually want to, maybe live among them. The hybrid program for that, millennia, long time. Not going to happen soon. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your technology is. It's going to take a long time to do that. And so part of what our observers are doing here, I believe, in part, is there is a hybrid program. Some of the people, the majority, in fact, of the people of experience I speak to, the little gray guys, I'm sure we've spoken before, so you know my theory on them. I think the little gray guys are biological robots with the consciousness upload, or they could remotely control them. I think the larger, taller ones are biological. typically people say they see them in the form of a hologram or as if they're appearing to them, which if you think, again, with our technology, and this is a decade ago, Tupac Shakur was playing a concert. That guy's been dead since the 90s, and it looked pretty real. That's a hologram, right? Imagine, so add 10,000 years of that technology. So there's a lot of moving parts to it. So for your study and the study of many people have experienced, there's probably several different studies and purposes for the subjects.
There probably is, and there are probably a number of different races who have different agendas or different scientific studies that they are working on all at the same time on this planet. I can tell you that I got too close to a craft when I was being taken to craft. This was back around 1990 or so, maybe a little before that. I wrote about it in my book, Forbidden Knowledge, a personal journey from alien abduction to spiritual transformation. And I was sick for many years. I lost my career because, I was burned. I had hair loss. I lost a tremendous amount of weight. I was extraordinarily weak. And it took a long time before I started to feel better. But when I'd begin to feel well, I'd want to go back into my profession, and I would then become ill again. So I don't know precisely what was going on with me physically, but I had no idea that I could ask for healing. I remember being taken to craft in that time frame, and the entities, it wasn't very often that I was taken, but they would put me on a table and I would feel a very strong electrical tingling sensation pass through my body. And then they would project an incredible feeling of love toward me. I hadn't felt the intensity of that kind of love on this planet. And they would say, "We are family."
They could probably trigger, consider the human brain, it's the most complex computer on the planet currently, still to this day. We know that we have chemical responses where emotions are involved. We have chemical responses as far as, acuities. They could probably trigger these things and give you that sense of, hey, look, we're here for the benefit of you. Because truth be told, this is the truth. If they wanted to harm us, it would have been done a long time ago. They would definitely not let us have the power of the sun at the tip of a missile before considering this, right? So
yes, absolutely. They could have harmed us. They could have enslaved us. They've had a very long time in which to do that. But when did that activity increase in our history? It was after we detonated our nuclear weapons.
I agree. I looked at Cheryl Costa. Are you familiar with Cheryl?
Yes, I know Cheryl.
Fantastic book. Great statistics. Made me think about everything all over again. It's like she really put me in a position where I got to really rethink this now. And you're right. Post atomic energy, the interest in us has increased. And I could say why. So imagine, Kathleen, you have your ant farm, big 55-gallon tank full of ants. You love them. You put food in there, water, all that stuff. You take care of them. You're watching them evolve, right? You don't really get directly involved because your job is to observe. One day, you're in your laboratory and you hear boom, and you look over and a third of the ant colony has been wiped out.
Yes.
Yeah. You're going to be like, holy shit, what just happened? Now you have to watch, because again, you can't get directly involved. This is like, in Mother Nature when we're observing animals and there's a fight between lions and hyenas and they're killing the cubs. We can't do shit about it. That's nature. You hit them with the car, then you're obligated, right? Like Travis Walton. You get hit by the ship, now we got to fix. You got damaged by the ship, we got to fix her. That's an obligation. But you're definitely going to pay very close attention to these things they're making. Like they're making bombs that literally heat up to the sun. It changes the physics. It could alter. It could actually. And I often wondered if we're testing these nuclear bombs out, are we affecting a parallel existence? Unknowingly. So yeah, they're definitely going to pay very close attention to that. And I think it definitely, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. By all means, I'll go on forever. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to add, a lot of people may not know this, but when our scientists were experimenting with these nuclear weapons, the UFOs showed up and they saw them.
I read that.
And they, at first they wondered if this was just some kind of fallout that was the result of the nuclear weapons being detonated. The early ETs who communicated with Admiral Herbert Knowles and Wilbert Smith, and the information went to Dwight Eisenhower. And I've written about this based upon the files that I have in my book, Forbidden Knowledge. We're told by these ETs that the detonation of nuclear weapons tears into the fabric of the time-space continuum, and it creates havoc. It causes damage out through the dimensions.
Yeah.
And that it was very dangerous for them to come here on that mission to try to change things. But they came as volunteers to attempt to help us, but also to attempt to prevent us from leaving this planet and taking our form of friendship, which is not friendship at all, out into space or out into their environment.
Right. Or so consider, here's Earth. We now know there's a lot of Earth-like planets. We could very well be one subject of billions. Like, this is an extremely intelligent species that's probably observing life. There's probably the National Geographics of the universe. There's different planets they're observing as well as they're observing us. And in their minds, there's no way we can let these people who actually let religion and politics and race dictate how they feel about each other. Not to mention they have a weapon that can melt a city, go to another planet. And there's no way. Because in the history of us, the history of humans is we go somewhere new, we find new people, let's teach them something, but believe the way I do, or we're going to end you. You know, that's the habit of us. So I could see why they would want to prevent that.
Yes, I think it's a good idea to quarantine us until we learn to get along with one another.
Yeah. I mean, back to the nuclear testing. You're testing a bomb in a desert somewhere because it's vacant. To us, we think it is. Now, you're using the power of the sun, which is obviously altering physics. How do we know we're not melting a whole city in a parallel existence, killing all these people unknowingly? You know, we
absolutely could be.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. You know, so there's a lot of frightening factors to what we do. We do things inconsiderately all the time. It's who we are. It's not till we get something like Neuralink or some sort of thing where we're connected to our brain all at once, and things like race, religion, and politics won't matter because you're seeing the person for who they are internally, right? You're conveying messages directly. So until we behave like a species, I don't think we really have a shot at communicating with anything above us. It's unlikely, you know?
That's right. You know, the Creator has tried for thousands and thousands of years, but it hasn't worked.
Yeah. I mean, imagine you walk into a building and everyone's got bats and they're beating each other. I mean, there's no way you're like, well, I'm not talking to these people. They're out of their minds, you know? So, all right. So back to, some of the other experiences you had directly, what are a couple that stand out to you, and did you get some sort of message from it, or what did you learn from it directly?
One experience I had that really stands out in my mind is when I was taken just before the alien abduction files was published, and they were extraordinarily interested in reviewing the work that I had done, and Denise Stoner as well had done on this book. They were checking it for accuracy. They said that there is much false information about them, and it is giving humans the wrong impression of who they are and why they're here. And they did not want that to be continued in the book that we wrote.
Right.
They also told me that my family, they had been in contact with my family. I believe it was for 6 generations.
I was going to ask that. That was going to be one of the questions. Does this stem back, and because prior to the generation of Betty, the UFO phenomena wasn't known very much. And if I swear to you, Kathleen, I looked through history, especially biblical history, where they speak of these beings as angelic, and to everything I read sounds like something from what we're seeing today.
There is an overlap there in the messages that they give, and it really makes me wonder. I don't know if there's a difference between what we think of as angels and ETs. Both heal us, both, well, I guess it's the divine that channels through us to heal others, but also ETs can heal us. Those who have been in long-term contact with what we think of as ETs are often healers and can channel this divine energy. That's the way I think of it.
Yeah. Because
through the tops of our heads, out through our arms and our hands to people who are ill and they can be healed, and even animals who can be healed. So, what is that overlap? That's something that I'm studying, that I'm really getting into right now. Because
if you go back to the Middle Ages, right? Let's go to the era of Parliament, right? And we take somebody gets injured back then significantly. We take them into surgery with our today's instruments and today's technology and the X-rays. They're going to call us warlocks and witches. They're like, what, that's not of God. What are you doing? You just see inside of that person and fix bleeding inside? What they would think we're supernatural, right? So if we did go back in time and heal someone with today's technology, just ours, not even something as sophisticated as our observers, just our technology. Through the course of time in the books that are jotted down and people recall this, by now we'd be reading about these mystical warlocks that appeared out of thin air, and they had machines that were seen inside of people. And it was all magic, right?
Yes.
And we'd read this like, wait, that's an X-ray machine. What's this guy talking about, right? But at that time, they wouldn't know how to explain it. So now you have a sophisticated being that's coming down, and the influences are mitigated. And imagine the stories they would conjure from that. They're definitely angels and other beings. It's
When they healed me, I woke up during the night with intense pain, internal pain. In fact, I've never felt pain so intense. And I woke my husband up, and I said, "You might have to take me to the hospital. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm having a heart attack, if I'm dying, what?" And he said, "Just lie there for a minute. And if it doesn't subside, I'll take you to the hospital, or I'll call an ambulance. You tell me what to do." And the next thing I knew, I was in a different environment. It was hazy. I was lying on a table. There were 2 glowing, tall entities on each side of my head, and I could just see them kind of through my peripheral vision. And I was feeling that intense tingling sensation all through my body. And I was wondering, what is happening? And they showed me a chart. I'm still not certain if this was a vision, a hologram, or a screen, but it showed my body, or the form of a human body, lying down, and there were like little bots moving all through the periphery of my body. And then I saw my internal organs, and some were highlighted in pink and some in mint green. And they told me that it was almost over. So I would be relieved of the pain soon. And when I woke up the following morning, I felt like I was 23 years old again. Not an ache or a pain in my body, loads of energy. And then I have not had a relapse. That happened in 2012. It's 2022. It's been 10 years, and I have not had a relapse from that illness.
You know, exactly the way you describe that. So I watch a lot of science documentaries too. I'm one of these buffs. And that's something we're talking about inventing, that we're working on currently. The concept of it is nanotechnology, being able to perform internal surgery without the invasive, cutting people open invasively as we do now, that they would use nanotechnology to go internally inside of you and make repair or remove cancer, or even if there's an obstruction, to relieve that. So everything that you're saying, I had friends ask me, well, what do you think their technology is like? I'm like, well, whatever we have now times 1,000 or more. They've had ample time. Humanity, we had wonderful inventions in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, crazy inventions, damn near computer-like in by theory, right? Why did that stop? Why did we stop inventing? Well, Rome came in, took over with Constantine and Catholicism, and that stuff's against God, and it's done. So we're 2,000 years behind where we should be, right?
Yes, unfortunately, the barbarians have gone in over and over again. They've killed the academics, the brilliant people. They've burned their books and their records, and they've sent them back into the Dark Ages. Well, they subjugated them.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, because I was watching a documentary once where there was the ancient Greeks had a clock that worked with water hydraulics, and it was remarkably accurate. I remember being like amazed by this, like, wow, why did that not continue forward, right? And sure as hell, Constantine, Rome, the takeovers, and then Alexander, and in other words, believe like me or be conquered.
Right.
It's unfortunate that we didn't let people prevail with technology, because it was against some written word that already had 10 rules that we should follow those 10 rules. Period. It's insanity. So for you, what you went through, you are witnessing technology at its finest at a much advanced rate, like thousands of years on us. So when you tell people that, and when you recall that, understand that these are things we're thinking about doing now. We want to get there. You've experienced it already. They're ahead of us.
Yes.
So
So I was grateful to them for that.
Well, there's some level of importance too, right? So someone like you is conveying the message about them that is enlightening, right? It's not good, it's not bad, it's just enlightening. And not to mention your family is already a subject. It's within their interest to keep you viable and going. I mean, they have to be forward thinking, because eventually it's going to get to a point, eventually anyway, if we don't destroy ourselves. And even then, I think, consider this. They're taking samples from all humans, right?
Yes.
We as humans right now are taking seeds. We have places where we're storing seeds and the DNA of every living thing on Earth. And it's kind of like the Noah's Ark thing, but just stored DNA. In the event we wipe ourselves out somehow, that we can repopulate later on with the DNA and the seeds, and from all the different animals and plants.
Yes, as long as we don't wipe that out as well. But
exactly.
These ETs have been taking plant samples. They started with the flora, and they were seen back in the early 50s and through the 50s in farmers' gardens, collecting soil samples, collecting plants. And then they started to collect animals of different types. And then they moved on to humans.
Right. Part of the cattle mutilations, consider what cattle is here on Earth. I can't say all of them are visitors, but a small percentage have to be. And it's, the idea is, let's get the organs, let's see how they work. Because you could only use DNA so much to have a general idea what that thing was, but you would still need a blueprint to recreate it. And so I think a lot of that plays a part in it. It's it's people, it's humans that put the stigma on everything, right? Because if, let's go back to the 80s. If you were forming opinions about religion in the 80s, you could end up dead, you know? Thankfully, we've evolved somewhat on that. We've made room for the idea of letting people have a freedom here anyway. Can't speak everywhere. But for the observers, everything about it sounds scientific, like a study, right? So in your family, yes. What's the earliest relatives that you know they've had experiences and they couldn't explain it?
That is secret to me.
I see.
I know that Dr. James Harder came out to study my family. He was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and he also worked with my grandmother, who had had close contact with a craft. One landed out behind her house. So, you know, I think that it at least goes back to my grandmother.
Right.
Before that, I don't know, perhaps.
Strong chances that there's think about people way back when they didn't tell if they had a mysterious something happen, especially back when they used to hang you for being a witch or burn you. They definitely didn't speak about it, right? They kept it inside because God forbid they find out they're going to try to test me as a witch, and we know that didn't end up well for anyone.
Yes.
So there's a strong chance, yeah, because I do a lot of off podcast interviews, a lot, and the one thing I do hear is it seems it's definitely generational.
Yes,
and it does skip every so often, depending on the person, because you know that if you have a guy and he had 12 kids, you only really need to study 2 of them, maybe one, you know, because 12 is a little excessive, but it's definitely happening. Let me ask you, so in your observation of the beings, did you get how do you determine who's biological and who's not, or what was your feeling on them looking at them?
The ones that I thought were biological were those who I sensed emotions from, who were responsive, who I saw time and time again, who formed a relationship with me. And then there were the smaller ones who seemed only to move when they were told to. They were the sort of the guards, the ones who made sure that you didn't take anything that belonged to them when you left, the ones who would get you up and escort you to be taken off the craft, that sort of thing. They're little guys, and one time they made a mistake and dropped me, and I was injured. But after that, I remembered them putting me back into my bed, and there was one standing on one side of me on the bed, and there were 3 in all. The other 2 were on the floor on the other side of me, and I could hear kind of almost a whooshing, some kind of sound or something coming from them, but I couldn't even describe it. Maybe it was just an energy. And they were sort of almost like measuring everything to make sure that I was put back perfectly. And I think that it was to compensate for the mistakes or the mistake they had made.
Right. I mean, no one's perfect, right? There, one person I'd spoken to off podcast, he used to wear pajamas to bed. He's like silk. He described him as like silk, and he would always put the bow on his lower part in a certain way, where he said his reason is I could pull it in one stride and I could use the restroom, and then I could put the bow together the same way as putting for securing the pants, always the same way. And he said it was different, and I was like, and that's what it took you to know, because I knew then I was visited. I do. So when you hear a man of routine, and because he ultimately knew something was happening, he would have very vivid dreams, and when he said when it happened, he could feel it. I was going to ask, I forget to ask often, but do you have like a feeling of their presence as it's happening or before?
Yes. Yes, I would know in advance when they were coming. I would receive a telepathic message that they were coming, which was not good when I was terrified
Right. Yeah.
of them, and I wouldn't be able to fall asleep, and then they'd show up, and I'd be awake, and so that was not pleasant for me. But yes, I did know when they were coming. There were other times when I didn't know later on,
Right.
but when they were taking me more frequently, they would let me know.
There was a gentleman I'd spoken to, and he said for him, it was like, it's Tuesday. So he really, the sensations, because he said in the beginning, it was like this ominous feeling of dread, almost mixed with deja vu, right? That kind of moment where you realize, did this happen already? And then that feeling would come, and then he would know. And he goes, after years, he goes, man, it's just Tuesday. I don't even fight it. I don't think it, and the people, I say this a lot, the people I find putting up the biggest fight are alpha-minded people. These are people who are in control, whether it be a corporate control or a military, just people who don't like having control taken from them. Those are the ones with the biggest pushback. But everyone else...
And those are the ones who are injured.
Yeah, because they're thrashing and they're acting out. One thing, Kathleen, do you own a smartwatch now?
Yes, I do.
Perfect. Does it monitor your sleep?
My what?
Your sleep. Does it have like a sleep, like I have a...
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So
yeah, it does.
This one guy said this to me. I'm going to look into this deep as I can. Every experience he had, his REM state was outrageous. And one of his REM states were like 4 hours or something like that. And when he told me, I was like, what? I monitor my sleep every night. I wear a Garmin Venue too. 4 hours of REM is impossible. And it makes me wonder, I'm like, I wonder if people have experienced, if they wear a smartwatch, would that REM state be affected? I mean, it's something I really want to look into because...
Right. That's interesting. One experiencer said that he went to bed, he slept all night, and when he woke up in the morning, his smartwatch showed that he had ascended 6 stories into the air.
Yeah. I should have asked that. I didn't think that part. But yeah, so because if you think about it, so when I woke up from my dream I was like, there's no way I was taken. You know what I mean? I mean, it was definitely a dream. I was definitely under a lot of stress because, again, I've never witnessed anything. But then I thought to myself, what better state to get someone in their sleep? And when they are being interacted with, these beings are sophisticated enough. Most of their verbal communication with you, maybe it appears like it's being used to tell, mind to mind. But you're in your REM state. They're in your mind communicating with you as they're doing physical things to a non-moving you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I never thought of that. So those are some questions I'm definitely going to go over in the future as I look into it deeply.
Yes. Well, I used a game camera for a while. I had documented the number of days between contact experiences. And then I went out and bought a game camera, had infrared. Every slide was dated. It had the hours and the minutes on it. And it was motion activated. And so I set it up in my bedroom. It was about a month before I was anticipating another visit. And that way I was able to record the data on how frequently my husband or I turned during the night, how often one of us got up, that sort of thing. And then on the night when I was anticipating this visit, I had it set up, and I was all ready the next day to view the film. But what I ended up seeing was that my husband got up out of bed and headed out of the room, and he was gone for 2 hours and 11 minutes. He was headed to the bathroom. And then he walked back into the room. The game camera did not record any movement in the room in the 2 hours and 11 minutes that he was in the other room. Now, the strange thing here is He does not go into the bathroom for 2 hours and 11 minutes. He's never gone into the bathroom and fallen asleep. This was very, very strange.
Yeah, it's like they removed him for so, another thing I'm looking into, I don't think all forms of contact are physical. I think they could tap differently. An example would be a number of people, even as recent as Bill Konkoleski on the podcast I had, where their phone would ring, nothing would be there, and they would feel a sensation. And I believe that to be them downloading or uploading data. And so for you, when you're sleeping, again, they say the closest to death people get is while they're sleeping, right? Something I read. But in that state, when you're sleeping, your mind, your subconscious is somewhat sort of released from its cage, your body. And I believe they could somehow, extract or put in data to and fro in that era. And it sounds to me like they may have removed them.
Yes, they say they can do this when we're sleeping, and they even give information to scientists when they are sleeping to help them to advance. And they do come to me when I'm awake too. I can feel the presence. I sometimes receive information, but I can't see them. I only feel that very strong tingling in my body. I've seen shimmering. I've seen a shadowy entity, but I haven't seen them appear in the physical in front of me.
Right. Yeah, because there's a fungus that could take control of, and they call it a parasite, but it really isn't, because it doesn't feed on the animal. It just takes control of them, and then it births from them, right? And stemming from that, humans, of course, when we see this, like, well, how do we do that for people? And, so through research, we figured if you could trigger certain parts of the brain, you could control the body. You don't need your consciousness to do that. If you think of what your consciousness is, it's your soul, same thing. It's just energy that's controlling this machine we're in. And so when we want to walk, our brain's got to send the information to the limbs. All right, we got to do this. Well, same could be done externally, I would imagine, with that kind of technology. So the husband's like, right, we need to do some downloads with Kathleen. You got to go. So to the waiting room he goes, You're not the first I've heard this from, by the way. I've heard this from a lot of people where they're significant. One lady had spoken. I just recently talked to her too. I handwrite stuff, Kathleen. Yeah. One lady says her boyfriend was on the couch just sitting there. And when she woke him up, he had no idea how he got there, but she's someone of contact. Now she says he's never been contacted or taken. So again, in that scenario, I'm like, they removed him so they could do whatever they need to do with her. They just neglected to put him back, or or they just lost a connection to do so, one or the other. So it's not abnormal. And the more I read about this, the more I find a lot of parallels and a lot of patterns. So
there are, absolutely.
So for you, the investigations you do, and you've been doing a lot, what are some of the more intriguing ones you found?
There was one that I find extraordinarily interesting because Stanton Friedman, the late nuclear physicist, had introduced me to two women. And those women lived in North Carolina. And they were paranormal investigators. They were well-educated women, and they did their work very, very professionally. This was sort of a hobby they had, spirit hunters of the self. And they wanted to do an experiment at an experiencer's home. And they wanted to know if I would introduce them to an experiencer who was a verified experiencer. Their contact events were absolutely real. It had been verified. So I thought of one in North Carolina, and that's Chris Bledsoe. And so I contacted Chris, and I told him about them and asked if they could contact him to set up this experiment that they wanted to do. And so he agreed to do that, and they set a date. they went to his house and they interviewed him and spent the afternoon with his family as well. And then when darkness was coming in, they set their equipment up. They had a Bell and Howell camera, video camera, that they had set up in one part of the yard. And that part of the yard was by a tree that was known as the burning bush or the burning tree. And Chris was able to collect clothing and photographs from people who had illnesses. There was one woman who had end-stage ovarian cancer who was healed after he put her photograph and her clothing into this opening in this smoking, what they called the burning tree. So they set the camera up there, and then they went to another part of the yard with Chris, and there was sort of a hedge, a row of bushes between them and Chris's house and the rest of the yard behind. There was a garden space in front of them. So they were out there with all of their equipment, being paranormal investigators. They had a ghost box to try to record electronic voice phenomena. Chris was calling in craft. They had cameras. They did not have cell phones. They did not take their purses or anything else except for the equipment that they worked with. So they were out there, and Chris said, I think that's one coming in now next to the moon. And they were all beginning to watch it. And Pam Nance she's permitted me to use her name, is the one who was holding equipment in both hands. And she was asking questions, and she was beginning to receive electronic voice phenomena. And the next thing that they knew, they were standing there in the same place. They were no longer holding the equipment in their hands. They didn't know what happened to it. They were swaying back and forth, and they all felt a little nauseated. So they finally found their equipment underneath those bushes that I talked about. They walked to the tree, they picked up the camera and the stand, and went into Chris's house. And his wife met them. She was in her nightgown, bathrobe, and she said, "Where have you been? I've been looking for you." And Chris said, "Well, we were just out there." And she said, "No, you weren't. I looked for you and you weren't there." And so no one knew what to make of that at the moment, I guess. But they sat, the women were going to drive back to their home that night. They lived about 3 hours away from Chris's house. It was 1 o'clock in the morning then. They were missing, about a couple of hours' time that they couldn't account for. As they were leaving Chris's house, a very bright object swooped down over their car. You don't know how many times I've heard that same story from experiencers who were taken from their vehicles or had already been taken and now were driving. It's happened to them that way too. And they arrived home. The women had a falling out because they had vague memories. And one of them had vague memories of observing one kind of entity, non-human, the other, another kind. And that falling out was because they did not know that two different races of entities could be working on the same craft.
Yeah.
Well, MUFON ended up investigating it, and they contacted me immediately. But one of them was experiencing a lot of trauma, and I would never investigate a case that would increase that level of trauma. So I encouraged her to work through that trauma. And then when she did, I would do my own investigation. And I would also offer hypnosis if they would fly down or drive down to Florida, where I live and where I have my office. And so it was a few years later, there was a long process that they went through for recovery. And then they started to look at this film. And on that film, they found non-humans.
Wow.
And I have that film, they've copyrighted it, but I have been able to do an analysis of that film. And I've taken pictures from it. And so I have stills, and I've enlarged them. I've lightened them because it was dark. And there are a variety of different non-human entities on that film. It was very interesting that one of them was sitting on the ground. You saw a sort of a purplish blue light, it's kind of an indigo light, just shoot out across the screen, almost like a laser pointer. And then you would see entities who were not fully materialized dropping off that beam.
Huh.
And that one that's sitting on the ground suddenly lifted up in blue light, that same purplish blue light. And he was holding something in his hand that had a blue light. He appeared to be sitting on something. And he just crossed the screen in front of that camera, not realizing that he was being photographed or videoed. And he just glided across the screen, and he would turn from side to side, looking for something, and probably for those people. And with that flashlight, and I think that blue light was to capture them into that beam so that he could take them to craft. There was also what looked like almost like a fairy coming down with a wand type device in her hand. She seemed to be wearing a long dress, and she had very large feet. And then there was a huge flash of light, and one showed up, and it was quite close to the camera. You could see his whole body, and he was dressed in dark clothing. It seemed almost to have accordion-like folds in it. And it was wearing some kind of headgear. You could see a chiseled nose sticking out. You could see a couple of eyes and a chin, maybe a slit for a mouth. I'm not positive about that. But it was wearing some kind of headgear that partially obstructed the face and all of the head. It was a very, very interesting film.
It could be a heads-up display, right? Like something they use. Imagine like what we use in the field for military. We have night vision goggles, and it obstructs the majority of our face, along with something that goes over our ears to hear better. It increases your ability to hear your surroundings. And the blue beam, I hear about a lot. And everything about the blue beam tells me it's isolating particles, meaning it could stop you in real time.
It can. I suspect that it's interdimensional in nature.
Right.
Experiencers who, we don't do this in hypnosis anymore, but in the early days, when a person was being taken to craft, they would feel like they were coming apart. It's just that they were going into a higher vibration. And when you go into a higher vibration, your atoms, your molecules, but also your atoms are involved in this, and they're moving at a higher rate. And when your molecules move at a higher rate, then they become dispersed. You're less solid. And so I think that's what was happening in the early days when they were taken to craft, and under hypnosis, they would describe it.
Yeah, in science, by the way, that's another parallel. The frequencies, the vibrations. I hear that through paranormal ufology. I hear it in science. You hear it in music. It's known to our planet vibrates. The organs in our body have a vibration level. Everything does. So for something more sophisticated to utilize a technology that learns how to manipulate that's not outside the realm of possibility. We're thinking about doing that for propulsion eventually. That's the direction we want to go in. We don't want to use...
excuse me, I've spoken with 3 physicists about that. Dr. Claude Swanson was one of them. Dr. Rudy Shield was another. Late Claude Swanson recently passed away. Was an outstanding theoretical physicist, wrote a series of books where he explained the soul's existence beyond death. He explained the paranormal, all in terms of physics. Incredibly brilliant mind. Rudy Shield retired from the Harvard Smithsonian Astrophysics Laboratory. They told me that, theoretically, all atoms are 99.9% empty space.
Right.
And so all you have to do is to
charge them with another particle.
You have to raise the vibration to the vibration of whatever you're entering into or passing through. And atoms can interpenetrate atoms. It involves a vibrational rate and I'll have to look that up. It's been a while since I talked about it.
And it makes sense because the blue light that I hear about, again, in my opinion, is isolating particles. I think that's a key role. And for one to have on hand would make sense, as it itself is isolated, brought to the ground, has a smaller version of it to isolate a subject, then for a larger one to take control and pull it in. I hear this a lot. And it's not...
Yes, they said that you have to align frequency and phase, and then atoms can interpenetrate, and that we had already done it on a small scale using neutrinos at the CERN.
Yeah.
And they told me this in 2013.
There's a lot, Kathleen, there's a lot there that people, I say this a lot, people that call this fantastic are, it's nonsense. It's too fantastic. Look at today's science. Look at the things we're working. In fact, there's used to be documentaries, because I watch those like crazy, about our future weapons and the stuff we could do. And on that very show, they're talking about how they're using vibrations and sound waves to both stop a pursuing enemy in his tracks and or kill him with it, right? On that very show, they're talking about ways to manipulate the human brain to like suppress them and or put them into a state of where they can't fight back. I mean, there's a lot that we have in concept that imagine something with 10,000 years on us. Forget it. It's practical use for them at that point. I mean, look what we did in less than 100 years. I mean, it's crazy what we've done.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Our phones, the technology is leapfrogging week to week, let alone year to year. Yeah, we probably already have phones that are prepared for the next 2 years where it just gets faster. We did that in 100 years. Imagine imagine what we're doing. If we don't obliterate ourselves, what are we doing in 10,000 years? Forget it. It's the sky's the limit. As far as your imagination can comprehend, we're going to be doing that. If we have 10,000 years, we don't kill ourselves, and we keep applying technology, the likelihood of us being in physical body still might be unlikely because, there's all sorts of scientists right now mapping the human brain with the intentions of uploading and downloading our consciousness So imagine we have a bipedal robot on Mars doing science, and we can now send our consciousness to that robot to do the work. We don't physically have to go there.
Yes.
So
and the ETs have stated that some of them have stated that they do precisely that they download their consciousness into these smaller gray entities.
I firmly stand behind that. I still, to this day, because I did a lot, before the podcast, I did a lot of research on a little gray one. Not so much the other species. I have my own theory for that. But the little gray guy is like a drone. And that very well could be that it's an avatar for the consciousness of other beings. Now, to what you were saying earlier about there being multiple species on a ship, it's very practical. Think about this. You have one group of intelligent beings here. Another group comes along, and the first group's like, listen, hold on a second. You don't have to go down there. We have these little gray guys. They're proven. And these are the new 2022 models. They can get the job done. We'll show you how you can upload your consciousness to them. And so you could be on ship above the atmosphere while they're down there doing the work. And if you need to come down there and actually retrieve, here's the other side. And we'll rent this out to you. You know what I mean? I mean, that's what we would do. I say this because people are like, well, that sounds crazy. Like, well, if we found another planet and the United States has a technology where we could put our consciousness into a smaller robot to do science on the ground, you better believe we're renting that technology to the rest of the planet that want to do science there. It's just how it's the best way that we can't breathe the air right away. We don't want to disrupt the natural environment. This is a plausible way of approaching that. And I believe it.
In the case that I just mentioned to you about Pam and Ashley and Chris Bledsoe, Pam or Ashley, I think it was Ashley, was told that all of those entities have the same consciousness, that they may look different, but they're the same.
Yeah, there's a source. I mean, that's where I stand with the afterlife and what we are, by the way. I think our consciousness and our soul, I think it's the same thing. I think there's an architect behind everything we see the universe over, and there's a source for our energy.
There's a source consciousness that is the highest consciousness, and that is the creator.
Right.
Is what I have been told by ETs.
And it makes prime sense because...
And then there are the creator's helpers who are the ninth dimensionals. They're not the creator, they're not in the divine, but they're close to that. And then there are different layers of entities underneath that. The higher the vibration, the easier it is to live. You stop having wars after a while. You develop technology. You start to share with one another as you rise up into the different dimensions. That's the way the Council of Eight explained it to us.
I mean, for me, that makes the most sense because here, let me read this to you. This gentleman I spoke to off podcast, he is a scientist. He didn't want to go on the air. He doesn't want to be known. I understand why, but I will highlight something he said. These entities, he calls them entities, as most of us, that the ships we see coming to and from Earth are exploratory, right? They're here for purpose. And some may be on planets in places we can't see them. He says, but the majority he suspects, their main ship is, it's basically a large asteroid, and they come and go from it. It's in the asteroid belt. That's where they reside. And when he said this to me, I had to take a few weeks and think about that. I'm like, well, that's a long trip. And then I thought, well, what am I talking about? There's one that Commander David Fravor saw that went from one point to another point in a split second in our atmosphere. Not only did it do it in a split second in our atmosphere, there was no sonic boom. None of the waves are disturbed by these things. Nothing in the air is disturbed by it. So who am I to say what's possible or not, right?
Yes, well, they can descend from 80,000 feet to 40,000 feet in less than a second.
Right.
And then to 50 feet above the churn in less than a second.
Right. And so for them to have and so then I had to think simply. I had to reel it in a little bit. I had to take some of the technology away and apply humans to it. we would definitely go to another planet. We would definitely want to be able to have a base on planet where the natural order, it would have to be contained because we couldn't breathe the air. So it would more than likely be underground where we could control the environment. We could have our own atmosphere internally. And we would definitely have a place of like a home base that would be far off planet that we could go to and fro. And if you consider how big some of these asteroids are that are in this belt, it's plausible. It's very plausible because the externals are rock. What better thing to protect you from radiation and particles that are moving 30,000 feet in space? And in the internal is where they build. It makes, when he said that to me, it rang bells like, wow, that is absolutely something mankind would do. We're actually even considering the idea that we would use asteroids and hollow them out and use that for space travel potentially. So.
Yes. And these entities who live not far from Earth and very large craft say that they originated from other habitable planets, but that they generally just live in this asteroid belt or this area close to our planet now, and they very, very rarely go back to their planet.
Yeah, I mean, it's natural gravity, it's prime protection, and there's some out there that we call them small planets, because they're large. When you think in the realm of those possibilities, it's very likely that if something's sophisticated enough, it could be observing us, and we wouldn't even know it. People have this misconception about what we see in space. I hear skeptics say all the time, well, we got telescopes and NASA. I'm like, what? That Hubble can only account for one small, tiny speck at a time that you see all these stars and galaxies in. So you have an idea of how large that is. It's not looking at the whole universe. It's not possible. Nothing we have could do that. So if something's in the Kuiper Belt or set up somewhere locally, we wouldn't be able to detect it, especially if it's rocky surface and it's not emitting if it's matte in nature and it's not really reflecting the light of the sun, forget it. The possibilities are limitless at that point. And I say that because that makes the most sense for me, because I hear scientists on these documentaries think this way, and that's us thinking this way. Add 10,000 years again. Somebody's probably accomplished this.
And I think that many of them live under deep bodies of water in very large craft that they use as bases here on Earth as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an intelligent species that is observing us. And they're like, well, how could we be, we obviously we have our bases outside the planet, right? How could we be on planet so we can do some of our studies up close and personal without detection? And so if I'm observing humanity, the first thing I notice is that, well, they're looking into space and they're going into jungles, but they're not looking in the oceans. That's a prime place. And we have the technology to submerge without disruption and build beneath there and create our own atmosphere. It's Kathleen, the sky's the limit. That's exactly what we would do,
Yes. Well, they can live down there. They can come up very, very easily.
Yep.
And not be seen in our airspace if they're low enough. Yeah. Or if they have some kind of cloaking technology, which they must have.
I think a lot of the pilots that are seeing these things, I don't think if they want to be detected, they wouldn't be. I think this is them saying, look, this is what we got, just so you know. How do I know that? We do it all the time to other nations. It's so if you look at the David Fravor in the 2004 Nimitz thing, it's one object's going from, he noticed it because at the water level, there's the tic tac right above the surface, and below the surface appeared to be something else down there, right? There's some wash going on. So it appears that they're going from the atmosphere to the water level, connecting with whatever's down there, and then leaving. And so whatever's down below the surface is now the next vessel, taking them to their next location. It's a pulley. It's a system. They like the elevator, taking you from the top floor of the atmosphere down to the ocean level. Now your connecting flight is below the surface, and you're getting on that, and that's taking you to the base below the waves, into the rock somewhere. It sounds...
Yes, and the one that David Fravor spoke of was as large as an aircraft carrier, and it was under the water.
Right.
And the Tic Tac was bouncing back and forth like a ping pong ball over the top of it. And they had the impression that they were communicating.
Right. or they could be, I mean, to us, we see it bouncing, but it's using a different frequency, right? So we're not able to perceive exactly what it's doing. It could be that, again, they're transferring occupants from that Tic Tac to the thing below the waves to go to the next place. The Tic Tac
possibility of it.
Yeah, I mean, look at UFOs. They're like our cars. Everything we have on Earth has a purpose. Buses and cars don't look the same. The Tic Tac to me sounds like transport. The UFOs that are more lower profile and disliked, like what did Bob Lazar call them? The sports version, sports car. All right, this is getting around quickly. The larger ones are, let's say, hypothetically speaking, we have a new race of alien that came to Earth. Well, we want to observe them too. Okay, let's take you on a tour so you can see what we're up against. So the larger vessels could very well be them showing others, this is what we have here. You know, it's a larger group of entities. You know, I have no science background. I have a pretty vivid imagination, and a lot of what I come up with is based on what I read and learn, you know, and then I apply what we do to it, and I scale it up, because that's really, you have to do it that way, you know?
Well, I think that you're gaining a pretty good grasp on what is occurring through the process that you're using. So I commend you for doing the reading that you're doing. A lot of scientific reading will certainly give any of us information that we didn't have previously. And I'm very pleased that so many government scientists are now involved in this investigation. And just so happy with Gary Nolan, who was hired by the CIA to study Havana syndrome, and then ended up working with a medical team out of Harvard. And what they discovered is that they were looking at the brains of experiencers of contact, especially those members of the military and the scientists who had close encounters with craft or were taken to craft and then had physiological effects. And they thought that there was brain damage because they saw something on the side of their head. And then they realized that it was actually a patch, and that this patch was creating the same abilities, such as psychic awareness, such as spatial awareness, in all of these individuals who had been taken to craft.
Wow. You know, I'm glad you said that. A lot of people, so the human brain is basically a copycat version of one another, right? It's the same hardware. It's all the same computer. The only difference is some people have the software to perceive certain things. Like, I think psychics have different software. It exists in the brain. It just doesn't work. You're not utilizing it. And I always example the guy. I'm still amazed by this guy. He got in a car wreck, some significant head trauma, and can play the piano at a master's level out of nowhere, you know? So for our government, though, Kathleen, moving forward, this whole disclosure thing, I find it interesting. Unfortunately, when you hear the government speak, it's the same kind of vague, you know, play off. Where as you feel they're disclosing, they're also belittling it a little bit.
Yes, it is. It's unfortunate that they're doing that. But when you think about the average American, there could be public hysteria. That's what's held our government back. From the very beginning, when they decided to launch this cover-up back in the 40s and into the 50s and on, that it's all been concern about the population. I read on the internet today, it was just going online, and the news popped up and it said, government concludes that UFOs are Chinese drones. And I just thought, oh my goodness.
Here they go again.
Maybe something is a Chinese drone,
I mean,
but certainly these highly advanced aerial vehicles are not Chinese drones, and they were this advanced back in the 1940s, before we had drones.
The biggest argument to that, again, would revert back to David Fravor, 2004, long before the Chinese even knew what a drone was, right? You have this large object moving through space, through air, not disrupting air, no sonic booms, especially at the rate of speed it's peeling off at. It's not affecting the anything around it, the atmosphere, nothing. We don't have, I don't care what they say, there's nothing we have currently that could do that. Or else we would throw up a mark on it, charge people a lot of money, and trips to Europe would be instantaneous. That's just how it goes. Rather than them disclose, and here's what I would say to any government official listening. Don't disclose. Acknowledge. I get disclosure. You're worried about, I worry about the same thing. There's people here on Earth. I know them. They're God-fearing Christians, and if the aliens did come here and they are peaceful, in their minds, they're the devil, period. I know the enemy when I see the enemy. That's unfortunate, but that's how humans are. So acknowledge it. It is
unfortunate, but their mind immediately goes to the devil.
Right.
Even when Jesus was demonstrating that he could heal, what was said about him?
Yep. He's the enemy.
It was demons. It was the devil inside of him.
Yeah.
The humans tend to react the same way. They have fear, and fear turns to negativity. And it's very, very unfortunate, but that's just the way we humans think. In fact, the ETs said to me that their primary concern was that our technological development was out of sync with our spiritual growth. And they are attempting to increase our spirituality. And that they said that there is one creator, and that our consciousness, all of us and them, are all under that one creator.
Yeah.
If people would look at things that way, we could get along with each other as a world population. We could respect each other's differences, but we're all brothers and sisters. We all came from the same seed.
Yeah, I believe there's an architect. I completely support that. For the government, just how about, if you don't want to disclose, because UFOs could be a great scapegoat for new testing stuff, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, just give greater public acknowledgement of what you can speak to, what is happening. Acknowledge the abduction for what it is. It's real. And I imagine for our government, it's really hard for them to say, well, there's nothing we can do about it because there's a blow to their pride. Reality check is it's there. Acknowledge. You don't have to use disclosure, just use acknowledgement at a greater level. So for the government, I heard one person tell me once, where's the budget for, we're going to open a new development in our government to look into this? Well, you kept it secret. And if you want to do that, so be it. But fund MUFON. Give MUFON some money. Throw some funds their way. They're already out there in every state, in most countries, doing the work. At the end of the day, you're just collecting data. And then by all means, screen the data and see what you find plausible. At least acknowledge it. At the end of the day, it's unfair to a lot of people, and it's why a lot of Kathleen, how many people I speak to off podcast, it takes them forever to reach out to me, and they're a doctor, they're a lawyer. One guy I'd spoken to works in Port Authority, and because of their job, they don't want to be, even now. Can you imagine? Even now, we know UFOs are real. It's not even a question anymore. It's a fact. So the real question mark is what's controlling him. Like people like yourself and investigators have a grander, or experiencers, you have a grander idea. But still, at the end of the day, these people shouldn't be afraid to speak what happened. It's terrible. It's not forget the idea that it can harm their job. It's not a good way to treat a fellow human, period.
That's absolutely true. But for decades, scientists have been discouraged from even speaking about the UFO presence. At one time, back in the 50s and 60s, there were a number of scientists, PhDs, people who were high achievers in their field, who would debate, who would be able to investigate all of this and debate this topic.
Right.
But then it was suppressed. There was an organized plan. I have evidence of it. You can read it in my book with Stanton Friedman, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. We found this information in an archival collection in the correspondence files of these scientists at the American Philosophical Society. There was a plan to suppress this, to tell scientists that they can't be scientists and believe that UFOs are real, and to have them sign a petition stating that they will never appear with any scientist or anyone else who has a scientific interest in UFOs.
Yeah, that's
they would be ostracized.
You know, it's unfortunate because that's not healthy science at all, right?
No, it's not.
I mean, if you think about what science is, it starts in the imagination of a child, right? And then it blossoms into a theory, and then later on becomes a science, either fact or under work. I mean, everything comes from stems from an imagination. It's not like we were born and there was a book here ready for us to read with all the facts in it. We discover things. It's how science is conducted. It's really an irresponsible approach for them to do that. But then, you know, look at the flip side, Kathleen. They're probably in the mind of the government, like, well, we have, you know, it's basically entering the Cold War. We could test stuff out. We can always blame it on the UFO. So if we make it seem like it's a nonsensical fiction, it's a good scapegoat, you know? But even then, right now it's 2022. We're talking decades later. It's irresponsible now. Can't do that anymore. You're shunning people. And, you know, there could be much learned from, but who knows? Who even knows?
If you look at the history of some very highly classified, top secret work by the government that has been partially declassified, you'll find that the things that the government scoffs at, the things that are taboo, the things that they have scientists saying simply don't exist, of the things that they are most interested in and are working on.
Yeah. There's a lot of 3-letter acronyms out there that played a very large part and still do in researching remote viewing, psychics, the paranormal. Because listen, if tomorrow somebody in the CIA found a ghost and they're like, listen, we need you to be a spy for us, you know, the deals will be made, right? If they found demons, let's say they found demons, like if I cut a deal with you, yeah, I'm going to go to hell, but can you spy on our enemies for us? In a heartbeat, they're going to do that. No question about it. You know, it's just, people don't realize everything we have today, everything, the internet, GPS, every crazy technology you see today was a military application once upon a time. That's just a fact.
Yes.
Before we close, Kathleen, let's name your books again. I'm going to put them in description for people to find. I want the new one too myself. Mention some of the recent books and I'll get them in description for you.
Yes. There's Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And I have updated it with new information and new scientific investigation. The 60th anniversary edition. Science Was Wrong, again with Stanton T. Friedman. Then Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers with Stanton Friedman. The Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner. Forbidden Knowledge. And there's one more, Extraterrestrial Contact, What to Do When You've Been Abducted. And that tells you how to investigate and how to document your own evidence. It talks about the results of our studies on experiencers, how experiencers undergo certain changes that are not common in the general population. It talks about becoming psychic. Helps people to adjust to what is occurring. If you're frightened, the steps that you can go through to take care of all of this. There is a little worksheet at the end of every chapter to help experiencers.
Excellent. Kathleen, you're a busy person. I envy your energy. I really do. I mean, you a lot of production. So for those of you listening right now, we're going to say good day, good evening, or whatever it is for you, and I'm going to talk to Kathleen in post.